I think we may have to resume that at some other time. So why don't we do our roll call? I'm sorry about the internet. Thanks for everyone for sticking around, by the way, despite our internet problems. Thanks for sticking around, despite all of that. Why don't we do our roll call? I'll call you out as I see you, names and locations, and then we'll start answering super chat questions. We'll do it that way. Really interesting that whenever I'm like refuting the right-wing smears, all of a sudden the internet stops working. I've noticed that. It's a weird pattern. I've noticed that whenever I'm like doing one of these things where I refute the right-wing smears, they come after me. So interesting. Ryan in Oakland, Bolshevik 1917, Philip, Cedar Park, Texas, Micah in Las Vegas, Chaya in Montreal, Nassau County, Char Darling, Gabby Hernandez, Rochester, New York, Alexis, Temple City, Nathaniel Westerman, St. David's, Bermuda, Burien, Washington, Calgary, Jenny Lynn from Cincinnati, Dubai, United Arab Emirates, Bart in Winnipeg. We got Bergen, Christian in New Jersey. We got Sage Rage, Beehive State, Ash in Chicago, CPI, Balthazar in Oakland. We got George in Detroit. We got Jared in Virginia, Moscow, Russia, Spider-Man in Jerusalem, Kendall in San Diego, Daniel in Oakland, from Mother Russia, New York City, Columbia, Illinois. Very, very good. Adam in Salt Lake City, Mo and Danielle in Pomona, California, Jordan in Chicago. We got Windy City Socialist in Chicago, Zachariah in Seattle, Auckland, New Zealand, Adam in Salt Lake City, Yada Yisrael, Nathaniel in Missouri, Zach in Seattle. Very, very good. Enoch in Australia, St. Louis, Chicago, Yada Yisrael. Very, very good. Very, very good, folks. Very, very, very good. Hit the like button. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the notifications bell. I'm sure Don D from NYC has already sent me the super chats, so I'm starting to pull those up. We'll keep calling people out. Names and location. Cleveland Pirate Alex, Don D in NYC. Thank you for getting the super chats for me. Moonlight in Beach, California. We got Daniel in Seattle. Nice roll call. Yeah, Kevin in Baltimore. Moonlight Beach. So there we go. There we go. There we go. Very good. Very good, folks. Glad you're with us. Kevin in Baltimore. All right. You know, Jenny Lynn in Cincinnati is with us. Good stuff, folks. Good stuff. All right. So I guess we'll do some of the first. We got super chats here from Don D and NYC. We got super chats. All righty. Okay. So I'm opening up. Got the super chats here. We're going to start going through them. I'm going to start going through the super chats. All right. And if you have something else you want me to talk about, by all means, keep the super chats rolling in. So there we go. Christian from Northern New Jersey asks, right-wing argument, socialism in the USSR and China was only productive because of oppression, forced labor, lack of freedom. Without this, it wouldn't be productive. Well, that's simply ridiculous, because you could say the same thing about the United States. Oh, you could say, oh, the United States, you know, it was only able to become a superpower because of slavery, because of the slaughter of Native Americans. And that's simply ridiculous. If you look at it, the strengths of the Soviet Union and the strengths that they had were based on the fact that they had a rationally planned economy. It was based on the fact that the profits were not in command. They had a rationally planned economy where they could allocate resources and strategically plan out production. And let me add that you'll hear this argument from the very same people that deny that it was productive. First, they say, well, communism never achieved anything anywhere. That's the argument. And then you point out, no, they were the first people in space. They electrified all of Russia. They, defeated the Nazis. They invented mobile phones. They invented the AK-47 rifle. Okay, so first attempt is bullshit. Oh, okay. Well, then it becomes, yeah, they did all of that, but they violated human rights. And then you point out, well, yes, that capitalist countries also violate human rights. And the reason the Soviet Union became an authoritarian place is because it was surrounded and it was under attack and it was being bombarded and it was facing economic sanctions, etc. And then they say, oh, well, now all of a sudden, then they'll say, well, the only reason they were able to do all of that is because of their oppressive system. I mean, they're just grasping at straws. First attempt was a lie. They had economic successes, a lot of them. Second attempt was a lie, saying, oh, well, there's economic successes are canceled out by human rights violations, as if Western capitalist countries and capitalist countries across the developing world don't have those. Third attempt, you know, I'm sorry, 3 strikes and you're out. I mean, and that's how the argument with these people goes. Now, Jason Blazer is asking me about my thoughts on the essence of time movement. I don't know anything about that. I've never heard of the essence of time movement. Never heard of it. So I don't know anything about it. So I can't comment on it because I don't know anything about it. All right. Now, Chaya asks, is wages for housework the best way to combat Malthusianism? What about collectivizing child rearing? Wouldn't those policies increase birth rates? I've heard debates about this, right? So this was something that was raised during the 1970s. There was a feeling that if a woman wants to be a stay-at-home mom, that she should receive a wage from the government for this. The idea was that, you know, there's a lot of women who are stay-at-home moms. They take care of kids. And that instead of, you know, just having them have to depend on the state or have to depend on a man to take care of them, that they should receive a wage as compensation for doing that important work. Under capitalism, I think that makes perfect sense, right? The idea that, you know, if mothers are going to stay home and raise children, that they ought to receive some kind of compensation for doing so, to make sure they have adequate resources in order to do so, to make it so they're not completely financially dependent on a male figure to be a breadwinner. I'm for that. I'm for aid to mothers. I'm for a stipend for families that are raising children. I believe Richard Nixon advocated that. He advocated as part of some of his policies, and you wouldn't know this now. Republicans would never advocate this now, but he did advocate that any family that has more than 3 children should get, you know, some kind of payment, automatic payment, you know, from the government, so that the family wasn't humiliated and wouldn't have to beg for welfare. You know, and that kind of you know, and that some kind of, you know, compensation or assistance, right? I mean, and we have stuff like that now in the form of tax credits, but actually compensating women who take on the task of being stay-at-home moms and raise kids. I'm not opposed to that. I'm not opposed to that. Now, it's been pointed out that there are some people that say that in the context of a socialist society, not in the context of a capitalist society, but in the context of a socialist society, that this is actually a counter-revolutionary demand, because in the Soviet Union, they're trying to increase industrial output as much as possible, right? Under Stalin and the Soviet Union, economic model of Russia more or less progressive. Oh, that's a good question. More progressive. They're arguing essentially that that in the context of the Soviet Union existing, Soviet Union is trying to raise people out of poverty. The Soviet Union is trying to build up its industries as quickly as possible, and the idea that we would take women out of the workforce, out of the industrial workforce, and instead give them a wage to work at home, that was a counter-revolutionary demand. And I think that in the context of the Soviet Union in the 1930s, that was probably a negative thing, that it was very important for the Soviet Union to bring women into industries. But we're not in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And in the context of a future socialist society, would we have a wage for women who choose to stay home and be stay-at-home moms, you know, and take care of housework? Or would we want to incentivize women to join the industries and have collective child rearing? I would think that that would be handled based on what the needs of the society were at the time. And also, I think it would be good to have the option. I think if a woman wants to work and be a working mom, there should be child care services available. And it would be great if a woman wanted to stay home and be a stay-at-home mom, she also had those kind of resources. And the idea of giving people that option, so we could compensate people for being stay-at-home moms, or we could compensate people for getting into the workforce. I think both, and giving people the choice. You know, and what's wrong with a stay-at-home dad? You know, that is one thing that I will say is a little bit of a double standard, right? That, you know, if a woman is a stay-at-home mom, she lives off her husband, that's fine with everybody. But if a man is a stay-at-home dad, you know, every woman, her friends are going to say to them, leave that loser. He's not taking care of you. Well, that's based on the fact that as a society, while we're moving toward more equal opportunities, we're not close. Women still don't make what men make, and there's still a lot more barriers to women. So I'm not saying that women are fully equal to men in this society, because they're not. But while we're moving closer to more equal opportunities, there's still not equality of expectations, right? In theory, right? If if we have equal expectations, it should be just as respected for a man to be a stay-at-home dad as for a woman to be a stay-at-home mom. And I don't see that, right? You know, the feminist women, you know, they'll be all about, you know, their female friend, you know, who is a stay-at-home mom getting supported by the husband. But, you know, if the dad is staying at home, or if the husband is between jobs, they'll be like, leave that loser, he's nobody. You know, and that's not that, you know, and when opportunity changes, expectations also have to change, you know. And that's one thing that I've noticed is a little bit of a problem, is that, you know, it's not exactly normal, right? And that as we open up opportunities for women, we still maintain kind of traditional expectations. And then that can be a little bit of a problem. But that said, you know, I'm not opposed to women getting compensated for housework. I'm also not opposed to women getting compensated to work, you know, in industry, right? I'm not opposed to that. And I think giving women that option is a good thing. And again, you know, I think, you know, the Soviet Union was opposed to compensating women for staying at home because they were trying their hardest to pull their country up out of poverty and industrialize, you know, as rapidly as possible. They needed as many people in those factories as they could. And so part of that was empowering women to work in factories, but they didn't want to incentivize women to be stay-at-home moms. They built, you know, collective daycare and kindergartens, collective kitchens, etc. Whereas, you know, in another socialist society, we might do things differently. And this is the whole thing. We're sitting here and all these kind of things are based on the context of the society at the time, what it needs. And ultimately, none of this has anything to do with whether it's socialist or not. So, and this is one thing we don't want to get trapped in, the idea of socialism, of dreaming up this exact blueprint for what socialism is going to look like. Because ultimately, when socialism comes into being, it won't come into being as a result of a vision that you and I dream up sitting here on our live stream late at night. Rather, it'll come into being as a result of contradictions in society playing themselves out, and the effective intervention of society into those contradictions by working class revolutionary forces. So there you go. That's the first super chat. If you have more super chats, folks, keep them rolling in. Keep them rolling in. Nathan Westerman sent an appreciation sticker, many of them, and I appreciate it. Any suggestions on an order of Marxist, Leninist, and anti-imperialist readings? Oh, wow. I get that one a lot. A lot of people, they ask what readings, and by all means, we don't have very many super chats left. So by all means, keep the super chats rolling in. I guess I'm going to take, there was another follow-up email from Don of super chats. No, just anything else. So if anyone else has anything they want me to talk about, by all means, please send a super chat, because we got plenty to talk about. But anyway, anti-imperialist readings. You know, I think that if you really want to read Marxist stuff, you really shouldn't start with the classics. You really shouldn't start with the classics, because the classics are polemical. They are arguments among Marxists, and they are written based on the assumption that you know the basics. I would start with The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster, which is a history of the Marxist movement. I would start with Why Communism by Moishe Olgin, which is a great text. It's an introductory text to communist ideas. Why Communism by Moishe Olgin. I try to write introductory text. A lot of my books are like that. City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, Getting Rich Without Capitalism. They are written in this kind of introductory language, just kind of giving you a basic introduction to the concepts. But after that, I would recommend reading The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster. That's a good place to start. The Communist Manifesto is a good place to start after that. You know, the History of the Communist Manifesto is kind of the introductory document that Marx wrote in 1848, explaining the beliefs and, you know, explaining his understanding of history, how history marches forward, the overthrow of feudalism, the establishment of capitalism. I would also recommend The State and Revolution by Lenin is a good text. I would recommend, you know, What is to be Done, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. These texts are worth reading, but you have to understand that they are polemical, and they're written in a polemical style, which is, it's an argument, right? It's an argument. It's Marxists arguing about what these concepts mean. So you have to understand the concepts. You know, one thing that's worth noting is that for every big book that Lenin wrote, he wrote an essay, a short essay, to kind of summarize it. Before he wrote the book, What is to be Done, he wrote a book called Where to Begin. a 10-page essay called Where to Begin. So before you read What Is to Be Done, go and read Where to Begin. How did Britain avoid falling into fascism in the 1930s? All right. If you want to read Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, I would recommend reading Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, which is a short 10-page essay. It's a kind of an introduction to the basic concepts. For every I don't know what you want to call it. For every full-length work that Lenin wrote, he has a very short Britain, avoid falling into fascism. He has a very short introductory essay that is very useful. So again, Where to Begin is an essay that kind of introduces the concepts of the party of a new type and the idea of the Bolshevik Party. Imperialism and the Split in Socialism is an essay where Lenin lays out his theory of what imperialism is and where it came from, how it developed. I would recommend that. I'm trying to think what other good texts are good. There's a lot of introductory texts that are useful, that kind of just lay this stuff out there, explain it in detail. I'm trying to think. If you want like an introductory, there's a number of books on Marxist economics that I would recommend. I have a lot of them behind me here. Michael Parenti, his books are very, very good. To Kill a Nation, Super Patriotism, Black Shirts and Reds. Those are some very good texts. One text that I really recommend that has really influenced a lot of my thinking is this book, The Future is Up to Us by Nelson Puri. This gets into the theory of overproduction, the explanation of capitalism and its monopoly stage of imperialism, automation and the computer revolution and that's impact on capitalism. I really recommend The Future is Up to Us by Nelson Puri. This is a very, very important book if you want to understand, the Marxist economic theories and how they apply in our situation. The Future is Up to Us by Nelson Puri. That's a book I often recommend to people. What else do I recommend? There's a number of books. Victor Perlow is a very good, economist. He's from the Communist Party, and he wrote a number of economic texts on American imperialism. That's very recommended. There's a writer by the name of Harvey Braverman, who wrote a number of very important economic texts, Labor and Monopoly Capital. Harvey Braverman has some very, very good texts that I would recommend. And then there's a lot of really good textbooks. The Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism. That's a Soviet textbook that is very clearly written and explains these concepts in very, very clear, precise language. The Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism. One book that I learned a huge amount from that you want to learn, the history of it is this book, and it's available. It's all online, but you can order it. The History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union short course. This is the official Soviet textbook of the history of their party, the History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union short course. And I would recommend this book if you really want to understand where the Bolshevik Party came from, how they evolved over the years, how they implemented their policies. I recommend, and, a lot of people, it just makes sense that if you want to learn about Marxism, you start reading the classics. And I don't think that's a good place to start. You want to read a textbook first that explains the concepts, that explains what the First International was, what the Second International was, the Third International. You want to learn the overall story first. You want to read a textbook, the history of the three internationals, the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union short course, the Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism. You want to read a textbook first. And after you read a textbook, then dig into the classics. That is my advice. I'm sorry, folks. I'm just trying to get everything below me here. I'm slipping and sliding on my floors here. I'm trying to get everything below me in order. But that's how I would recommend you do it. I would recommend you start with a textbook, and just kind of learn the concepts first, and then dig into the polemical text, the arguments through which these concepts are cultivated and developed. Economics is the most important part of Marxism. The philosophy, dialectical and historical materialism lays the basis for it, the understanding that all that exists in the world is matter, but that matter is constantly in a state of motion and change. A does not equal A. That's the philosophical side of Marxism. And the political side is, the struggle for the dictatorship of the proletariat and et cetera. But really, the essence of Marxism as a materialist philosophy is economics. And Marxism without economics ain't Marxism. you know, there's all this stuff. They claim that the modern left, because they preach postmodernism, all that, they're Marxists. No, they don't believe in Marxist economics. They don't want the banks, factories, and industries to be organized to serve the people. They don't explain the problem of overproduction and profits and command. So they are not, the essence of Marxism is economic, right? The philosophical side is important to understand. I actually am a little bit more of an idealist. I do believe in God, and I do believe that the power of ideas. So I'm not even fully on board with all of Marxist philosophy. You know, and then the political side is also extremely important, but the political side flows from the economic side, right? I highly recommend William Z. Foster's History of the Three Internationals. Very good recommendation, David. I absolutely do as well. It's a very important text. David has a great series with Dust James where they read that text. They read the whole thing. It's really, really awesome, really tremendous. I really recommend it. Go check out the Working Class Revolt series, reading that book. It's so important. But yeah, you know, the philosophical side, you know, dialectical and historical materialism helps you understand how the world works, how the world is constantly changing, how there are forces clashing with each other, how there's first a thesis and then an antithesis, and they clash to create a synthesis, and the synthesis becomes a new thesis, history being driven forward by contradiction. And then that gives you the economic understanding that there are economic forces in the world that are clashing with each other. And then that, with that economic understanding, that gives the idea of forming a political movement to fight for the working class. So those are the three kind of spheres that Marxism touches on. And the economic one, I missed a super chat. The economic one, I guess I'll scroll up here, try to find the super chat I missed. The economic one is essential. And if you don't, why haven't socialist countries tried to destabilize U.S. capitalism? I don't even know. I don't even know how to begin that. I guess I'll write it down. All right. Try to destabilize U.S. capitalism. All right. All right. And there you go. You know, the fundamentals of Marxism, Leninism are important to understand. But again, I recommend you begin with a textbook, and then go read the original text, because they'll make a lot more sense that way. You know, it's funny. I always tell the story that I was first getting interested in communism, was getting interested in Lenin. So I went to the library and I read the encyclopedia. Do you remember these things they used to have called encyclopedias? Before there was Wikipedia, there was actual physical books they called encyclopedias. My mom was a librarian. I knew how to look things up in the World Book Encyclopedia. So I looked up Lenin. And I read the article on Vladimir Lenin in the encyclopedia. And it said that Lenin's most important book was called What Is to Be Done. And I thought that sounded like a really exciting name. What Is to Be Done. And so I immediately went to the library and I ordered a copy of What Is to Be Done. And I started trying to read it. And I couldn't make heads or tails of it. I assumed, and it's called What Is to Be Done, and this guy overthrew the Tsar, that it would be an agitational pamphlet. What is to be done? Why, we've got to have a revolution and overthrow the Tsar. Couldn't have been more wrong. What Is to Be Done is a very, 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 very intricate pamphlet that is laying out a theory for how to form a revolutionary party and arguing against tailism and economism, arguing against this debate about freedom of criticism, arguing against terrorism, and arguing in favor of agitation and propaganda and democratic centralism. And when I first tried to read What Is to Be Done, I couldn't make heads or tails of it. I had no idea what it was. I had absolutely no idea what it was. And so I didn't open it again. I started reading it and I'm like, he's talking about freedom of criticism. What the fuck is this guy talking about? I had no clue what Lenin was saying. So I didn't open What Is to Be Done for a long time after that, because I just thought, this is gobbledygook. It doesn't make any sense to me. So it wasn't until I was a freshman in college and I was around a Maoist communist group that had decided they wanted to impeach George W. Bush. And instead of promoting communism, they wanted us all to go around promoting the impeachment of Bush. And I didn't agree with that. And I was saying to them that you know, no, we should go around promoting communism. And so they had a line struggle with, you know, about this. And so to try and convince me that we should be organizing to impeach Bush instead of going around promoting communism, which is what we'd previously been doing. But all of a sudden we shifted to going around to impeaching Bush. At that point, they said, well, let's go read What Is to Be Done. So we had a reading group and 4 of us sat down and we read What Is to Be Done. And I had never read What Is to Be Done before by Vladimir Lenin. I'd read The State and Revolution, but I'd never read What Is to Be Done. And by reading What Is to Be Done, that was an introduction to the tactical side of Marxism-Leninism. I was looking for my copy of it here, but I'll have to pull it out another time. And, you know, it was an interesting discussion. And we read a few chapters of What Is to Be Done, and then they made us stop because basically, you know, they wanted us to be reading material by this Maoist group. They didn't want us to be digging into the actual classics. But I actually got a lot out of it when I started reading it. The best advice I've ever gotten about the book What Is to Be Done is that you should read it backwards. Read the chapters in backwards order, because the book is written. It's written starting out about a very specific debate about freedom of criticism, and then talking about tailism and economism, then talking about terrorism, and then laying out the case for a all Russian socialist newspaper, etc. And at the end, he goes over the entire history of the Russian Marxist movement. And if you're reading it 100 years later, well over 100 years later, now it's got to be like 120 years later. It was published in 1903, so it's almost 120 years later. It doesn't, if you read it that way, it doesn't make any sense. So you got to read it backwards. Read it from the whole history of Russian Marxism to a more specific debate, to a more specific debate, to a more specific debate, and then it makes sense if you read it that way. And that's my advice for reading What Is to Be Done, which is a really, really important book, laying out Lenin's understanding of how the Bolshevik Party was supposed to organize. That's my advice. And so, you know, that's my experience. And that these texts are not, one of the biggest pet peeves I've had, and then I'll move on to the next super chat question, is that one of the problems with Marxist circles is that there's this highfalutenness where no one wants to admit they don't know anything. And because people don't admit they don't know anything, as a result of that, basic concepts don't get explained. There's this snobbery. When I first started hanging around leftists, they were all talking about the contradiction, the contradiction, the contradiction, the contradiction, right? I didn't know what the fuck they were talking about. I understood that, if someone says, hey, Caleb, the sky is blue, and you say to them, no, the sky is red, you're contradicting them. You're contradicting them. I didn't know what they meant by the contradiction. And so I didn't ask. I wanted to bluff, right? Because I had this pride, right? No one ever wants to go, I don't know what that means. But if it took me years before I finally was digging into Marxist philosophy, reading those textbooks, I understood the concept of what the contradiction was, right? The Hegelian dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. I understood it. And it's a really important concept when you understand it. But if people walk into leftist circles and everyone's going, the contradiction, I can guarantee you almost all those people that were in that room I walked into when I first walked into a Marxist bookstore and they're talking about the contradiction, they didn't know what it meant either. They were bluffing. And leftist circles are full of people that are bluffing and they don't know what they're talking about. The emperor has no clothes. And that's not good, because when people don't know what they're talking about, they can't put these ideas into practice. These ideas are actually very, very important. But if people are just bluffing and walking around talking about the contradiction, one thing that I hear all the time is people using these terms improperly without knowing what they mean. For example, the term neoliberal. The term neoliberal is an economic term. It is not a political term. Neoliberalism is a school of economic thought developed by Milton Friedman, developed by the Montpellier Society, developed by Friedrich von Hayek, developed by Alan Greenspan. It is the belief that the state should be more or less uninvolved in the economy, and that services generally done by the government should be done by private corporations, and that we should kind of go to as much of a totally free market model as possible. Neoliberal is an economic term. Neoliberalism refers to specific economic theories associated with specific economic thinkers. And though neoliberalism took hold in the Republican Party first, before it took hold in the Democratic Party. Richard Nixon was at first kind of embracing neoliberalism, and then he kind of opposed it. He had his Nixon shocks and opposed neoliberal economic reforms. Then Nixon was forced to resign. And after Gerald Ford came in, the Republican Party from then on was dominated by neoliberal economic thinking. Neoliberalism did not come to dominate the Democratic Party until the late 1980s with the rise of the Democratic Leadership Council and Bill Clinton. So neoliberal economic thought, is a school of economic thought and government policy related to economics that started out among conservatives and eventually expanded to the Democrats and liberals. But so frequently I hear people say neoliberal referring to moderate Democrats. They're like, oh, there's real progressives like Bernie Sanders, and then there's neoliberals like Hillary Clinton. That is not what that word means. It does not mean moderate Democrat. It does not mean moderate liberal. That is not what the word means. It is a word that refers to an economic school of thought, neoliberalism, which is privatizations, cutbacks, and reducing the role of the state in the economy. It is basically gutting the government. It's the belief that you can cut your way into economic growth. And the reason that people go around talking about neoliberals, oh, those neoliberals, those sellout Democrats who are neoliberals, the reason they're talking that way is because nobody knows what these words mean and no one stops. We create this atmosphere of snobbery where no one stops and goes, wait, what do you mean by those words? And we got to stop that. We got to stop that. You never want to create an atmosphere where people don't feel comfortable asking what words mean. So there you go. There you go. All right. I hope that answered your question. Someone else sent an appreciation sticker. Now, the next question we've got here is modern Russia more progressive than the former Soviet Union? I don't think so. No. Because, previously Russia was a fully socialist society. Now it is a society that had a counter-revolution, and that counter-revolution was defeated, but there wasn't a restoration of socialism. There was just kind of some of the entities that were left over from socialism being kind of empowered. There is state mobilization of control, but there's still, a lot of very wealthy people who are part of the counter-revolution that are in power. Russia is a very complex economic system that's very contradictory and confused in a lot of ways. Now, Russia is aligned with China. It's aligned with the socialist countries, and it is very much a Bonapartist state-run, there's a huge amount of state managing of the Russian economy. So Russia's economic model is far more progressive than what exists in the West. I mean, they are, they have measures to control their economy for the benefit of the population. So, but at the same time, I wouldn't call it more progressive than the Soviet Union was. No, but then you couldn't have the Soviet Union again either, right? I mean, the Soviet Union, that Soviet model is played out, right? And that, I don't think Russia could have the Soviet Union again, and that the Soviet Union's contradictions and problems led to its downfall, and that this is one of the traps you fall into when you're doing historical analysis, right? It's like, well, what if this had happened? Well, what if that had happened? No, what happened, and it happened for a whole number of reasons. And as a result of it happening, all kinds of things that wouldn't have happened if it hadn't happened. And you can't do this. Well, what if this had happened? Well, what if that had happened? No, I mean, Russia is what it is. And it's important to understand what it is and where it's going. It's important to understand how the counter-revolution was defeated. It's important to understand that there is still a lot of inequality in Russia and that it's not really a fully socialist society. The counter-revolution was defeated, but they haven't, fully restored socialism. Workers' power has not been restored in Russia. Russia is a complicated society. It's important to understand it, but like, it's not the Soviet Union, and it's not like you can't compare the Soviet. They didn't have computers in the Soviet Union, right? Computers hadn't been invented yet. The computers in the Soviet Union didn't arise until the 70s and 80s. You couldn't have Stalin's Russia in modern Russia, right? Yeah, I mean, it's like you can't compare these two things. Right. I mean, it's like, is the U.S. economic model in the 1800s superior to the U.S. economic model now? No. I mean, it's like in the 1800s, the U.S. economy was the way it was. The U.S. as it is now is the way it is now. You couldn't have had the U.S. current economic model in the 1800s. It wouldn't have worked. I mean, it's different contexts breed different economic models. The Soviet Union's economic model was a result of the unique historical circumstances the Soviet Union was in. And the U.S. economic model in our current times is based on unique historical circumstances the USA is currently in. So you can't argue that the Soviet model was superior or inferior. It's different. Now I would tend to lean toward being more sympathetic to the Soviet model because it's fully socialist. But you couldn't bring that Soviet model of the 1930s back to the Soviet Union, to former Soviet Union as it is now. That wouldn't be possible. All right, next question. How did Britain avoid falling into fascism? Well, the main way Britain avoided falling into fascism was because the British financial, folks were able to overpower the industrialists. That there was a divide in the bourgeoisie, and this happened in the United States as well, that you had kind of the global financial, institutions that dominated the world. And then you had factory owners and industrialists. And in the United States, the driving force of fascism was the factory owners. The factory owners didn't like the labor movement. They wanted to crush the labor movement. They liked the military because the military spent lots of money on guns and tanks and weapons. And they wanted the factory owners and the military to take over the government, and that was fascism, right? And they built a fascist kind of demagogic movement to facilitate that. And in Germany, it was the factory owners. Germany had been stripped of its colonies. The German finance houses had been completely weakened. I mean, there were German bankers at the time, Hollimer, Schacht, and others. But, what was left in Germany of its economy after World War I was mainly industrialists, Krupp and Thyssen. And they hated the communists who were organizing labor unions and strikes. And they also hated the British and American banks that were dominating Germany's economy after Germany had been stripped of its colonies after World War I. So in Nazi Germany, it was the factory owners who teamed up with Hollimer Schacht, who was like one of the few remaining bankers in Frankfurt and other places, and they seized control of the government. In Britain, you had Oswald Mosley, who was working for the factory owners. He was kind of a strike breaker, an anti-communist who went around beating up communists and striking workers getting beaten up, right? He was opposed to communists, but he also had this demagogic anti-banker thing, and he wanted a military government, by the military and the factory owners to crush the communists, but also, have the industrialists kind of take control, and stabilize the economy, use methods to stabilize the economy. In the United States, you had Henry Ford and Henry Morgan, very similar. They're the factory owners. And as factory owners, they wanted to crush the labor movement, but they also wanted there to be, extreme military spending to stabilize the economy with the military. Roosevelt was in with the Rockefellers, and the British capitalists were dominated by factions that were not the factory owners. You had a very big finance bourgeoisie that was not going to submit. The factory owners were not strong enough. Now, the British royal family liked the fascists. The British royal family were in with Oswald Mosley, and they were originally in with Hitler, and they were even during World War II. I mean, you had Edward II stepping down in the lead up to World War II because he was so well known to be a Nazi sympathizer. The British royal family, there was certainly a big current among the British ruling class that was sympathetic to fascism and Oswald Mosley. But for the most part, the bulk of British capital were not in favor of fascism. They were in favor of more of the global free trade system. And Roosevelt was like that. He was in favor of the global free trade system, the Keynesian model, right? It was a struggle among the ruling class. Now, the efforts of communists at the Battle of Cable Street, at the Flint sit-down strike, the Popular Front, they were key in pushing back fascism, but they were kind of aligned with kind of what in the United States we call the Eastern Establishment. In Britain, it's called like the City of London, against the industrialists, against the factory owners who wanted a fascist state to crush the labor unions. In Germany had basically been stripped of its finance houses. It had been stripped of its colonies and its ability to dominate the globe. So you had only the industrialists, and those industrialists were being kind of kicked around by the British banks. And so it was a complex situation, but ultimately it was about the balance of forces. If you look at the way the 1930s lined up, there were divisions in the ruling class. There was a pretty solid division between the industrialists and the bankers and the oil monopolies. And the oil monopolies were with Roosevelt and John Maynard Keynes, and the industrial factory owners were with the fascists. So there you go. There you go. All right. Why haven't socialist countries tried to destabilize U.S. capitalism? Well, if you ever read any anti-communist literature, they have, right? I mean, that's the allegation, right? The civil rights movement, the labor movement is all a big conspiracy from Moscow, right? It was all a big plot and conspiracy by the Marxists, the commies to, foment a peace movement and get us to not support Vietnam and support, it's all a big communist conspiracy, right? But no, I think socialist countries are struggling to survive. The Soviet Union was up against so much. China has been up against so much. Cuba, Vietnam, these countries are more interested in trying to survive in response to imperialist attacks than trying to stir up trouble in the imperialist homelands. But yes, have communists been key and in progressive struggles in the United States? Sure. And that's one thing that anti-communists frequently point out. That is true. And wokes try to obscure it. The woke folks are very embarrassed about the fact that the civil rights movement, there wouldn't have been a civil rights movement in the United States if it hadn't been for the Soviet Union. There wouldn't have been a labor movement in the United States that was strong enough to win the great victories it did if it wasn't for the Soviet Union. Women got the right to vote in the Soviet Union before they got the right to vote in the United States. And so, I mean, communists have intervened in progressive struggles, but wokes try to obscure that. The right wing used to always talk about that. It was a scandal thing. All the liberals are with the commies. But yeah, I mean, but for the most part, socialist countries are not trying to intervene in the politics of Western countries. They're trying to survive. They're trying to struggle to survive. you know, and they may be friendly to the Black liberation movement or the labor union movement in the West out of solidarity because they're struggling against the same enemy. But the idea that it's meddling or intervention, that's not what it is at all. It's a very different story. All right, folks, I guess if there's no more super chats, we'll wrap it up here. I do apologize for the technical difficulties. I do not know what that was about. It's very frustrating, kind of ruined our stream, but I think you got the overall point of what we're talking about. So I guess we'll end it here. We'll be back later this week. Talk to you soon. Gotta. New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.